poem we'll be looking at in this video is Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. This poem is, first and foremost, a profound and haunting commentary about power and about the human relationship with power. We will start by reading the poem aloud. It's important to remember when it comes to your revision that poetry as a form is meant to be recited, it's meant to be performed. That's why the rhythm, the rhyme, the meter are also important because they contribute towards the meaning. We'll read the poem together and think what it's about. We'll think about the context and what led Shelley to write it. I will annotate the poem, paying attention to language and form. There's a very interesting structural component that reinforces the message of the poem. Finally, we will think about which other poems you could compare it to in the Power and Conflict anthology. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." A very haunting poem. So, what is this poem about? What's the plot of this poem? It tells of someone who encounters a traveller. We have this first person narrator starting the poem I. We're not sure who that first person is, but the speaker meets a traveller who has just come back from some faraway, exotic and ancient land, an antique land as it says. And this traveller tells the speaker a story of when he or she came across a broken statue in the desert in the middle of nowhere. And on the pedestal where this statue used to stand, there's this famous inscription, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And obviously there is a distinct irony because there are no works, there's no kingdom left to look on. Let's have a look at the contextual backdrop that led Shelley to write the poem. First of all, who is Ozymandias? Who is this central figure to the poem, this long-dead king? Ozymandias is believed to be Ramesses II, who was an Egyptian pharaoh reigning from 1279 to 1239 BCE. He's also believed to be the pharaoh in the story about Moses in the book of Exodus. He was later defeated by the 12 tribes of Israel, and he used the throne name Ozymandias. So there's that link. It makes sense that he is the subject of Shelley's poem because his statue had just been discovered at the time of Shelley's writing, so he would have been a topical focus for the poem. Shelley and his contemporary were challenged to write a poem about it, so that's why he wrote it. Ramesses, as a pharaoh, is remembered for his tyranny, his military exploits, his large empire, and his ultimate defeat. Remember, the point of Ozymandias in the poem is that he thinks he's invincible, but he loses that power ultimately. But there is another historical influence as well, and that is the monarch at the time Shelley was writing. Now, Shelley was, as many of the Romantic poets were, anti-monarchy, which means he was against the monarch. He didn't believe there should be a king. King George III was on the throne when Shelley wrote the poem Ozymandias. He had reigned longer than any king before, and really he had outstayed his welcome. He engaged in many military exploits similar to Ramesses, and is remembered by some for oppression and tyranny. Remember, a tyrant is someone who exercises a harsh and unjust rule over their people. During his reign, the 13 colonies rebelled, and towards the end of his life, George's mental state declined, earning him the reputation of the mad king who lost America. He was the monarch on the throne when what would become the United States of America broke away from the British Empire. Remember, before the American War of Independence, America was a British colony. It belonged to the British. And so it was under George III that it was lost. Not only was Shelley anti-monarchy, he was also a pacifist, which means he didn't believe in war. So he positioned himself against George's military exploits. George III is often considered to be the inspiration for the poem Ozymandias, because both kings were perceived as tyrants through the lens of history. We always have to exert a degree of caution when making these links, however, because unless a poet or an author has explicitly confirmed an influence historically, it is difficult to say whether something is definitively, unequivocally an influence of a piece of literature. But it can't be disregarded. This was the monarch of the time, and Shelley disapproved of him. So immediately we start with that first person I, that first person narrator, who is the vehicle through which we experience the poem. Even though we don't know who that person is, it doesn't really matter, because the majority of the story comes from this enigmatic traveller. It's a framed narrative in that way. And what I want you to pay attention to from the beginning is how many different voices we encounter in the text. There are layers of different voices, and we'll consider that more as we work our way through the text. Who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies." So we move from these voices to strong imagery. We have the shattered visage. Remember, a visage is a face. We have two vast and trunkless legs of stone. So the head of this statue is buried in sand, and there are trunkless legs that don't have a body. It's very strong imagery. And we have a fractured or fragmented statue. It's debris, it's the remains of a statue, and it's quite striking imagery there. And it goes on to describe the expression on this half-buried face. So we have a wrinkled lip and a sneer of cold command. What is this telling us about the nature of the pharaoh? Does he seem a kind king? No. It's showing us that he had disdain for the people he ruled, and it implies he is a cruel tyrant. And a tyrant is an oppressive ruler. Tell that it's sculpted as well, those passion red. So the wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command are telling us that the person who sculpted the statue, the person who carved the statue, understood the true personality of the king, that this was not a kind man. And the sculptor knew this, and he had it stamped on these lifeless things. The sculptor recorded the qualities of the pharaoh through the statue he was making. And then we come to some of the most famous lines of the poem. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. A beautiful line, but very difficult to decipher grammatically. And I would suggest that that is deliberate, because that fragmentation of the statue, the broken images, the layers of different voices, that fragmentation, that fracturing trickles through to the grammar itself. It is deliberately ambiguous because we wonder whose hand is mocking and what are they mocking? Whose heart is feeding? We can have different interpretations. One interpretation could be, for example, that it's the sculptor's hands mocking the passions of the pharaoh. We could infer that the heart feeding is in fact the heart of the pharaoh because he's so conceited and arrogant that he needs to have his ego fed by the adoration of his people. But the point is, it is deliberately ambiguous. So the fragmentation of the statue infiltrates the grammar itself. And on the pedestal, so the plinth that is meant to be holding the statue, we come to the other very famous lines in the poem. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So we get this new voice. So we've had the voice of the first person narrator. We've had the voice of the traveller. We've had the voice of the sculptor in a way because he's shown us things through his statue. And now we have the voice of this long dead king. Obviously, here, there is a glaring irony in that there is nothing left to look on. There's nothing left of the kingdom. Look on my works. What works? You're looking at a desert. And remember, a desert is the epitome of a barren wasteland. There is nothing left. Nothing besides remains. And this is isolated by a caesura when there's a break in the middle of a line of poetry, drawing attention to it. And here it's drawing attention to this ironic juxtaposition. Remember, juxtaposition is when you place two things next to each other to highlight the contrast between them. So it's drawing attention to this ironic juxtaposition, that there's this proud, declamatory description, look at my works, immediately followed by something that contradicts it, because nothing besides remains. There are no works left. This is the centre of the poem, this juxtaposition between how Ozymandias perceived his own power, how he thought it would last forever, versus the true nature of his power and how fleeting it would be in reality. There is, in a way, a delusional outlook of Ozymandias's in this inscription, to think that he would always have this power to wield and that his kingdom would always exist and always be great, when actually there's nothing of his legacy left. And this loss of his legacy is reflected in the next lines. Around the decay of that colossal wreck, decay, things are falling apart, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. There seems an infinite emptiness to the desert, stretching away from the statue, that mocks that earlier arrogant inscription, "Look on my works, ye mighty." And that infinite emptiness, there's a bit of alliteration here, boundless and bare, lone and level, to draw attention to that infinite emptiness. But these lone and level sands are all that's left of Ozymandias' kingdom. We need to consider that Ozymandias is about a statue, and a statue is an embodiment of a person's power, a very physical reminder of their power and authority that is literally set in stone for posterity. When we think about broken statues, it's very symbolic. Think about regimes that have been overthrown. Think about, for example, that famous image of them pulling down the statue of Saddam Hussein. And it's a similar sense here, in that there is a statue, that embodiment of power, that has been destroyed. Here, though, it hasn't been destroyed by human beings, but by nature and by time. And that, there, is the heart of the poem. Man can think that they have power, and they can think that that power is infinite, but they have nothing when it comes to the power of nature and the power of time, because it is time that has completely destroyed the kingdom of Ozymandias. Let's discuss the structure of the poem. It's important when analysing poetry to consider the structure, because very often the structure helps shape the meaning. Ozymandias is a sonnet. And in literature, there are two main types of sonnet. There's the English or the Shakespearean sonnet, and there is the Petrarchan sonnet, which came from Petrarch, an Italian who lived before Shakespeare and is believed to be the originator of the sonnet. These two different sonnets have different rhyming schemes. Remember, of all the poetic forms, the sonnet is the strictest. It has the most rigid constraints. In order to be a sonnet, a poem must have 14 lines. Those lines must be in iambic pentameter, so 10 syllables per line, 5 iambs of an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable, de-dum, 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 so 10 syllables per line, and it must follow a specific rhyming scheme. It can only be a sonnet if it ticks all of those boxes. Now, these are the two different rhyming schemes, the English or the Shakespearean sonnet and the Petrarchan sonnet. Don't worry too much about the poems themselves, just look at the colours because they're showing you the rhyming schemes in question. The Shakespearean or the English sonnet has the rhyming scheme A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. You have those 3 4-line stanzas, or what we call quatrains, with alternating rhyming, A, B, A, B, C, D. And then you have that rhyming couplet at the end. On the other hand, the Petrarchan sonnet has a very different rhyming scheme. It's only divided into 2 stanzas, an 8-line stanza, what we call an octave, and a 6-line stanza, or a sestet, and it follows the pattern A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, C, D, C, D. Pause it now, because I want you to look at the poem Ozymandias and decide which rhyming scheme you think it follows. As you'll see, it's a mix. The poem takes the traditional octave volta sestet structure of the Petrarchan sonnet, but it uses an irregular rhyming scheme that is much closer to that of a Shakespearean sonnet. And like all types of sonnet, it uses an iambic pentameter. So it's a strange sort of hybrid of the Shakespearean and the Petrarchan sonnet. Why do you think Shelley might have done this? How might this contribute to the poem's message? Because it makes perfect sense when you think about it. The sonnet is one of the strictest and most rigid of poetic forms. And therefore Shelley, by blending the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean sonnet, he mirrors the message of the poem. And that message is that power, all power, even power of literary form and convention, is transient and subject to evolution. So by transient, I mean fleeting, and it evolves, it changes over time. If the enduring message of the poem is that power doesn't last, then that message extends to the form itself. The structure is reinforcing the message of the poem. It makes complete sense when you think about it. So, which poems could you compare Ozymandias to? You could compare it to Tissue, in that both poems focus on the loss of power. You could compare it to the Prelude, because both poems highlight the superiority of the power of nature over the power of man. And you could compare it to My Last Duchess, because both poems imply that humans' hubris and pride, their confidence and arrogance in their own power, is groundless, is baseless. It doesn't really exist, because there is a delusional undertone to Ozymandias' conviction that his power will last forever, And the Duke, the narrator in My Last Duchess, believes he has power over the portrait of the wife he couldn't control in real life. So there's a similar delusional undertone there. I hope this was useful and that it helps with your understanding of the poem. It is a very famous poem that does give us a resounding and profound message, a warning almost, about the human fixation on power.